Hi everyone. So in the last video we talked about the greater good strategy and some of the problems with the general strategy and how it leads to this idea that, well, in order to develop it, you'd have to actually give an example of a possible greater good that would justify God in allowing evil. Well, in this video we're going to look at a version of that response that's been incredibly influential. It's what's called the free will defense. So in the video, we'll just review the logical argument from evil. We'll talk about the difference between a theodicy and a defense, and then we'll introduce the free will defense. We'll talk about, well, what is it? We'll give an example to illustrate the idea, and then we'll introduce some things to think about for next time. All right, so let's look at this full developed version of the logical argument from evil. That is, if God exists, then God is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. So yet again, this is specifically targeting, it's specifically talking about that traditional theistic idea of God. Not because there aren't other ideas or because those other ideas aren't important, but just because that's what this particular argument is sort of investigating. All right, well, if God is omniscient, then God knows about any evil even before it happens. If God's omnipotent, then God has the power to prevent any evil. And if God is omnibenevolent, then God would want to prevent any evil. Well, if God knows about any evil, has the power to prevent any evil, and wants to prevent any evil, then no evil would exist. Evil does exist, therefore God doesn't exist. Now, as I said, many students initially think it's incredibly easy to respond here. They tend to appeal to the strategy that says there's a greater good. So a perfect God would not want any evil or suffering to occur since they're all good. However, God has justifying reasons to allow that evil or suffering to occur if that suffering is necessary for God's achieving some even greater good. Merely saying these words, though, is insufficient to respond to the logical problem. In order to give a response to the logical problem, you need to defend this claim that it really is possible for there to be a greater good, that it'd be necessary for God to allow at least some evil to exist in the world in order to achieve that greater good. But that seems rather difficult because God's supposed to be omnipotent. So shouldn't God be able to have the power to achieve that greater good without going through any kind of evil? So defending this possibility then is to give a defense. So a theodicy, remember, is an attempt to identify the actual reasons a perfect God has for allowing the evil we see in our world. A defense would be an attempt to identify just some possible reasons. Maybe they're not God's actual reasons, but some possible reasons that God would have for allowing any amount of evil whatsoever. So maybe not the evils we actually see, but just it shows how God might allow at least some evil, thereby showing how a perfect God and evil could coexist, and there's no contradiction in those two claims. Right. Even if we don't explain the actual reasons for why God allows the evils we actually see. All right, so here's the free will defense then. It says free will is a possible greater good. So, such that it would be necessary for God to allow evil in order to create this greater good. So, this depends on the assumption that free will is a very good thing. It assumes that a world with free will and evil in it is still better than a world with no free will and no evil. So, if that were true, an all-good creator would want to create a world with creatures that have free will rather than a world with only automata. However, by creating a world with this greater good of free will, the idea is that God thereby takes on the risk that the creatures will use their free will incorrectly and freely choose to bring evil in the world. God is still all good or omnibenevolent on this sort of picture because God doesn't want those evil things to happen. God doesn't will for those things to happen, but she allows them to happen in order to grant human beings this greater good of free will. As I said, this depends on that assumption that free will is a very good thing. Well, why should we believe that? Well, in the dialogue, this is just sort of granted for the sake of argument. Let's assume that free will has value. But notice, this doesn't seem that implausible. Most people really do care about free will. They care about their own autonomy, their ability to be in control of their own lives. when we imagine a society with a sort of authoritarian dictatorship where the government is controlling every aspect of a sort of civilian's life, the idea is even if people are happier in that world, so imagine like dystopian novels like A Brave New World, 1984, The Giver, if you've read any of those, the idea is those are worlds where even if people are sort of happier, even if there's less evil and suffering in those worlds, it seems like those are worlds we don't want to live in because people don't have free will. They don't have autonomy. They don't have control over their own lives. And that suggests that we really do think that free will is a very good thing. And so it wouldn't be implausible to think that if God were to exist, God too would value and think that free will is a very good thing. Let's consider an example to make this more concrete. So the littering example is one that comes from your book. Imagine we're at a picnic on the beach and I have a 6-pack of soda with those plastic rings connecting the cans. The wind picks up and starts blowing the plastic rings away. I'm intelligent enough to know that if I don't get up and grab the rings, well, those rings, a fish might get stuck in them and suffer as a result. But that day I'm feeling pretty tired, pretty lazy, and I think, yeah, I could get up, but I don't want to. And so I freely choose not to get up, and the rings blow away. They're blown into the ocean, a fish gets stuck, and as a result, it suffers greatly in pain before it eventually dies. Now, an omnibenevolent being, if someone's sort of all good, presumably they don't want that fish to suffer. So God is still omnibenevolent, it looks like, in this story. Well, what about God's sort of power? Well, that evil is not due to God either. The evil is due to my morally incorrect use of free will. Now, God, being omnipotent, had the power to create me without free will and avoid the suffering of this fish. However, free will is such a good thing on this story that God may allow the possibility of that suffering to come into the world in order to create a world where there are creatures with free will. Here's a couple questions for you to consider, though, when trying to evaluate whether or not this is a good response, and we'll investigate some of these questions in a lot more detail next week. Question number 1. Can God create people with free will that always choose to do the right thing? Now, this is a yes or no question, and the reason that this is important to consider is because, well, if you say yes, there might be a problem for the free will defense. What would it be? But similarly, if you say no, it looks like there might be some problems for the free will defense as well. So no matter what answer you give to that question, it looks like there might be some worries. Question number 2. Why might someone think that the free will defense is inconsistent with God's omniscience? So remember, God's omniscience is this idea that God sort of has perfect knowledge, knows everything. Question number 3. Can you think of any example of suffering or evil in our world that could not be explained as the result of giving human beings free will? So even if free will were to explain some of the evil, how some of the evil is possible, would explain how all of the evils in our world are possible. All right, so that's it for today. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.